Hanford was chosen during the Manhattan Project because it was isolated, and now a community of over 100,000 is grown up around the Hanford site and is dependent on it. And it's one of the most government-dependent economies in the entire country, like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It's a company town, essentially, and the U.S. Department of Energy, which runs the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, is the company. Now, outside, in the rest of the Northwest, what people know about Hanford is that from the 1940s into the 60s, massive amounts of radiation were released deliberately into the air by the federal government, and massive amounts of radiation were discharged into the Columbia River. But what people aren't aware is that the cleanup is going to take another 40 to 50 years, and that the Energy Department, which says we're cleaning up, we're spending $2 billion a year on cleanup, what they don't say is their idea of cleanup is to just cover up the plutonium under dirt. It's a cover-up, not a cleanup. And the public in the Northwest is become aware recently that the Energy Department continues to say, instead of cleaning up Hanford, we want to use Hanford as a national radioactive waste dump as we make more nuclear weapons and more nuclear waste, and as we make more nuclear waste from commercial reactors. So both ends, the weapons and the reactors, come together for a cheap place to be disposed, and the federal government keeps looking at Hanford to be that cheap place, even though it's right next to the Columbia River. And when we talk about next to the Columbia River, I need to give you a sense of scale here. The Columbia River runs through Hanford for over 50 miles. So think of 50 miles of shoreline with 9 nuclear reactors, thousands of contaminated sites, massive amounts of contaminated soil and groundwater. And as we're speaking here today, right outside the Muse No Nukes concert, contamination flows into the Columbia River at levels over 1,000 times the drinking water standard for strontium-90. Federal government sets our drinking water standard at a level at which 1 person out of every 10,000 who drink the water die of cancer. That's adults. Our children are 3 to 10 times more susceptible to die of cancer than an adult is. So when they say we're measuring radiation flowing into the Columbia River in these seeps at 1,000 times the drinking water standard, that means 10% of the adults would die of cancer if they were to drink water out of those springs. Then we look down the road and we say, what about the 3 Native American nations that have treaty rights to live along and fish this stretch of the Columbia River, and their entire cultures depend on this? And the estimate is that if they exercise their treaty rights, even one of the radioactive waste dumps at Hanford pose a risk of 5% of their children dying of cancer. We call that genocide, and they call it cleanup. Who are these people is a good question, because they like to say, these were mistakes we made in the past. The Energy Department, though, is still dumping radioactive waste in unlined ditches at places like Los Alamos and other nuclear weapons sites around the country, even though it's been illegal for over 30 to 40 years for your local government to have an unlined landfill for municipal garbage. And of course, it's illegal for us to dig a hole in our backyard and bury garbage, but the federal government thinks it's just fine to dig a hole in the ground and dump highly radioactive waste into it. And that's really sad. And it's going to take a concerted movement to say, this isn't the past. We have to move to the future. And the first thing you got to do is say, let's not make any more.
How long does radioactive waste last?
That's a really good question, because in light of Fukushima, a lot of people were told, oh, the radiation in the rain only lasts 8 days. So let's go back out and shower in it. And when we're talking about plutonium in the soil at Hanford, we're talking about a half-life of 24,000 years. Means the plutonium will last 250,000 years. The cesium in the rain that came across the Pacific and was far above drinking water standards, not just the iodine, they all only talked about the iodine, but the cesium will last 300 years. The iodine has a half-life of 8 days. The cesium that was in the radioactive rain that's still coming out of the Fukushima reactors, the cesium will last 300 years. And it is a very, very dangerous radionuclide. It's a gamma emitter. It goes into the bones. If it lodges in your lungs, it just stays there and can irradiate large areas. What we like to look at is try to explain to people in light of Fukushima that these claims that no health levels were violated, we've documented that the rainwater that was coming down in March and April in California, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho was as much as 130 times the drinking water standard. And we don't know what this is going to mean, but when we look at Fukushima, we see that the government in Japan is doing the same thing the US government would do. It raised the standard starting with school children. And the level of radiation that they're saying that school children can be exposed to would cause, again, a 2 to 5% fatal cancer rate in children. And that's what they're saying is safe for the children to play in the playgrounds at the schools outside the exclusion zone. It is sinful, and if we think our government would do anything different, no. Our government has already said, in the Bush administration, they said in the event of a dirty bomb attack, we're going to increase the standard for allowable radiation doses tremendously, the same level that the Japanese government used. Where did they get it? They got it from the United States. They said, well, if that was good enough, if you have a nuclear disaster, that's good enough for us.
I just can't believe that this all got set up without any consciousness of the future.
Well, we know now from looking at the historical documents that were declassified that as early as 1946, our federal government, at that time, the Army Corps of Engineers, which ran the Manhattan Project, knew that the radiation levels going into the Columbia River and other sites like Los Alamos were highly dangerous. And they chose to classify all research on fish and radiation in the Columbia River. And they kept it classified up until the mid-1980s. They knew. Not all of them knew, but most of them in senior positions knew. And the most stunning document is the first document saying after the World War II, saying we have to keep all the studies of radiation in the Columbia River and in salmon secret and classified, said until we solve this public relations problem. It was called the public relations problem in 1946. Of course, they never found a solution, so they just kept it classified. And today, we still have people who are nice neighbors, have nice children, who say, I wouldn't expose my children to something I think is dangerous. And they're saying, but it's okay to dump radioactive waste in unlined ditches. It's okay if we just cover it in 15 feet of dirt. It's okay if we don't stop contamination entering a river, even if the Native American treaty rights say we can live and fish there, and the cancer rate for children would be projected to be 5%. And these are regular folks saying, that's okay, we have to save money, or we can't make nuclear weapons production too expensive by increasing the cost of dumping the waste. And we can't
Where
increase the
dumping
cost
where?
of nuclear power
Yeah.
by using lined landfills. So at Hanford, there are 3 operating commercial low-level radioactive waste dumps in the country. One of them is at Hanford. It's operated by the state of Washington, and it's unlined and leaking. And that's where commercial reactor low-level waste is going. And it's the dollar, because the utility companies, business lobby say, well, doing it right would cost a lot more money. And then nuclear power wouldn't be so darn cheap. Not that it's cheap anyway. It's
Yeah.
more expensive than the wind, which is blowing nicely right now.
It's quite a racket they've got going.
It is quite a racket, and the craziest racket is the one which the racket made to say nuclear power is clean.
Right.
We have to wake up and realize that we can have an energy future in this country that relies on conservation, that relies on renewable, clean energy. We don't need the nuclear power plants we have today to have their licenses extended so that they can operate till they're 60 years old, which is just the definition of lunacy.